The United States, that fertile expanse of ambition and ingenuity, finds itself curiously short on one of life's basic necessities: affordable housing. The remedy appears as plain as a picket fence: build more homes and build them swiftly. Our housing shortage is the fruit of years spent neglecting construction, a bad habit born in the aftermath of 2008. Skilled labor has grown scarce, and laws governing land use and building codes often seem crafted less to facilitate homes than to frustrate them. But despair not. Our guest today has spent years contemplating this conundrum with both practicality and imagination. He comes bearing ideas, constructive ones naturally, that might revolutionize the way we build, clearing the way for millions of new homes to rise where now there are none. Stay with us, and after the break, we can learn together if this shortage might yet admit a remedy.
Are you ready to take your career in real estate appraisal to the next level? Join the Appraisal Institute, your go-to source for expert insights, industry trends, and the latest updates from the world of valuation. Whether you're an experienced appraiser or just starting out, they bring you industry resources, classes, and all the knowledge you need to stay ahead. Join today and be part of a community that's shaping the future of the appraisal profession. Visit appraisalinstitute.org to learn more and become a member. You're listening to the Appraisal Buzzcast with your host, Hal Humphreys.
We're so excited for this episode of the Appraisal Buzzcast. We're going to be talking about something that most appraisers don't know enough about, and that's modular housing. Let me bring in our host, Hal Humphreys. Hey, Hal, how are you doing?
I'm doing fantastic, Jim Morrison. Thank you so much for being here. This is 2025. We're well into 2025, and I think this new format for the podcast is going to be a lot of fun.
Well, we are really excited for the new format and the big guests that we've had. And this is going to be a really big guest. This is Ivan Rupnik, who knows all about it through ModX. Let me bring him in and you can introduce him.
Yeah, so Ivan, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. For our listeners, my guest is an architect and a scholar. He's the co-founder of ModX. He'll tell us more about that in a minute. Ivan, do you mind to tell us a little bit about who you are? What's your background, and what do you think you bring to the table here today?
Great. Well, thanks for having me on the show, and I'm glad to speak to different communities about this topic. So I'm a trained but not a registered architect. So if the AIA is listening, I've done my due diligence. I've studied at Louisiana State University, go Tigers, and at Harvard as a professional architect, but then also did a lot of research and doctoral work at Harvard on the topic of modular housing and why what seems like a good idea, why not make houses like cars, but with maybe more customization, has not taken off in the US and other countries. And so it's something that I've been looking at for a long time, but really got more into it in the last 10 years with my partner, Ryan Smith, when we founded ModX in 2019.
Okay, good. So, I mean, aside from being an underachiever and going, to Harvard and doing that kind of business, I came across your name through the New York Times, an article called "How an American Dream of Housing Became a Reality in Sweden." Tell us a little bit about your research. You got interested in why we don't have more affordable housing here. Tell us that story and what you've learned.
Well, I would love to say that I got interested in affordability because of affordability, but honestly, my first experiences was as a young architect working in practice and finding how frustrating it was that we worked so much and created so little value. So working particularly in multifamily condominium projects in New York City, I remember we would change materials every so often because the developers thought they would save some money. We would redraw. And so my first interest in this really came from very personal impact. I wanted to be an architect. I wanted to have impact, and I didn't want to waste my days. And so I really got frustrated with that. So I worked in other countries. I've worked in Korea. I've worked in Europe. And I found that architects were more efficient there and had a lot to do with the training, had a lot to do with the types of construction, but it also had a lot to do with the regulatory environment that they worked. And so I was sort of scratching my head and decided to kind of go back to school and research why it is that, a country like ours, which is very innovative, that, wants to have nice housing, why don't we get to have nice things? And then I found sort of some lines of interesting investigation where we really had very innovative ideas in the 1960s and 70s, very bipartisan innovative ideas. We can talk about that in more detail. And that we just didn't realize them, and other countries did. And they look very similar. The good ideas we've seen abroad are very similar to ideas we propose. They're not something that would be hard to do, and it would be something familiar for somebody from Apple or from Google today, and we just haven't done them. I'd love to talk about them more, but that really got me excited to say, I want to make a difference as an architect, but to be able to do that, I need to get a doctorate. I need to do this research, and I need to be able to find ways to impact the broader context, which is why I'm here today and speak to the broader built environment, because we've got to work on this together. The problems are quite complex, but the solutions are out there and they're quite realizable.
Yeah, I like that. And here's the thing, Ivan, 50 years ago, plus or minus, the Department of Housing and Urban Development came up with this idea. I think it was called Operation Breakthrough. That, based on, some of the stuff I've read in your work, was a really innovative and, as you say, bipartisan look at affordable housing. I think Mitt Romney's dad was the person that came up with this idea. Tell us about the rest of the story and why Breakthrough didn't actually break through.
Right. Well, so George Romney, who actually just recently got a presidential medal posthumously, maybe because of this work, I'd like to think so. He was he came out of the automotive industry and was actually brought into this project, Operation Breakthrough, to bring a manufacturing mindset to housing. And he not only worked for the private sector, he also worked in the public sector as well. He was the governor of Michigan. So he really understood the barriers to scaling. And he also was open to speaking to industry and to the public sector and to the NGO sector. And really the conclusion was already in 1968, we were really good at doing planned unit development, single family housing. And that had been a model in the 40s and 50s for starter home affordability. Believe it or not, by 1968, already there were no more starter homes. So the people that invented starter homes, Levitt and Sons, went to Congress in 1969 and said, "Hey, people, we've got a problem. We've got a problem. We don't have enough plumbers. We don't have enough electricians. We don't have enough framers. We don't have enough material, and we don't have enough land for more PUDs in the places where we have economic activity. Now we can go to the Sun Belt, but we're going to leave behind the Midwest. We're going to leave behind the Northeast." Sounds familiar? Sounds familiar? Yeah. I think we all live in that world now. They told that to Congress. Congress said, "Oh my goodness, we just sent a man to the moon. We just beat the Russians. We can fix this. What do we need to do?" Well, Congress said, let's not, we don't have a solution yet. We need to encourage experimentation and new technologies, but in a controlled way. We need to provide a basis for comparing those new technologies to existing ones. And most importantly, we need to figure out the effect of local housing codes and zoning regulations on large-scale use of new housing technologies. I'm quoting this from Congress. And they funded Operation Breakthrough, not to provide millions of units of housing yet, which is how people usually assess the program, but to do, though, that research to prove those points, to tell what we needed to do to change the regulations, because at that time we had 25 or more companies that were ready to do this so that we could do that. Unfortunately, what happened was prematurely, President Nixon cut funding for affordable housing in 1973, right before a war in the Middle East and the first global energy and economic crisis. That wiped out those 25 companies, and it also actually made it, for reasons that are still not clear to me, made those regulatory changes which were on the table, which were very clear, which were ready to go, and which had bipartisan support. They never were implemented at scale in the US. But fortunately, they were implemented in other places.
Yeah, and I think that gets into the legacy of Operation Breakthrough and what we learned from it and what it, I mean, obviously it didn't change a lot of things here just now, but it changed things in other places. And, in the introductory teaser we did for the podcast, I talk about, regulations don't so much facilitate the building of houses as frustrate the building of houses. I'd like to talk about that in some more detail, but what is the legacy of Operation Breakthrough kind of on a global scale?
Well, so I think the most literal direct translation has been in Japan. Japan, as we all know, had a close relationship with the U.S. in the post-war. Their automotive industry was, something that we sort of set up to fight the Korean War, actually, and then they helped us save what was a very dysfunctional automotive industry in the 70s. Well, they looked at the U.S. They brought delegations during Operation Breakthrough, and they said, "Wow, the U.S. is actually thinking about changing regulation, making it smarter, not necessarily deregulating it to make the regulation of construction work more like the regulation of other industries." So, which means that instead of having to choose between life safety and innovation, you can have both, like we have
Yeah.
in our cars.
Yeah.
And so they said, we love what they're doing. America's on their way. We're going to do this too. And in 1973, the same year that unfortunately Nixon cut this funding, Japan, after 12 or 13 years of experimentation, developed a housing system certification program where now companies that were willing to invest in R&D could really essentially have a fast track through all of the permitting inspection because their quality control systems, not their plans or what an inspector would look at. So today, a Japanese house can be delivered like a fancy car or a Tesla 2 months after you sign on the dotted line to the day at 30% less than what it would have cost without that regulatory shift. The house is higher quality, it's more resilient, it has all that zero energy, but it's not the technology that makes it affordable. And in fact, it's not affordable housing, it's actually market rate housing. It's that regulatory streamlining. It's not that it's deregulated, it's that the regulation is designed for a manufacturing process and an innovation process. On the other hand, just so we know, by the way, is that while in the US, only 10% of American consumers are allowed to customize their homes. Most of us buy spec homes. In most countries, it's 70-30. 30% is spec and 70% is custom, which is what we had before Levitt. And so again, the other thing that's Offsite has done is that it doesn't just make the cost go down. It is compared to plan unit development. It actually gives, which is something I think you would be surprised, but gives you more customization than you would expect. Just because that's one of the biases we run into. It's actually more customizable than what you're used to when you're picking from a unit in a planned unit development.
Oh, interesting. And so just kind of listening to you, it seems like your research into Operation Breakthrough was kind of a personal breakthrough for you.
Well, it was because really it was, a lot of architects are frustrated. I don't know if you know many architects. This really helped validate some personal experience I had in practice saying, we want to not only be more efficient with our time and make a reasonable amount of money. Every architect feels like it's Groundhog Day every time they work with a developer. But at the end of the day, the buildings aren't that different. People, it's a 2-bedroom apartment or a condo or whatever, particularly multifamily or a single family. And yet we always start from scratch, moving towards regulations that aren't really clear. Well, in Japan, particularly in the single and missing middle scale, they've figured out a way to make that more customizable and more efficient at the same time. And they did it based on really looking at and optimizing things that, again, bipartisan support existed for in the U.S. in the 1960s and 70s.
Okay. All right. So let me ask you this, Ivan. How does off-site construction work in places like Sweden and Japan where this is actually happening?
Right. Well, so they're, again, different. So some of the basic principles are similar. So there's a manufacturing mindset. There's an idea. The regulatory environment tends to treat it more like you would treat the manufacturing of a car. So instead of project by project inspections, you have a quality control system. But it's different. So in Japan, again, the offsite construction sector has focused on single family and missing middle, what we would call missing middle housing, where about 20% of the market goes through this process. So you have very consolidated 7 or 8 firms that have very recognizable brands. They have commercials on TV. You walk into a consumer center, you sit down with an architect, you sketch for 4 hours, you sign on the dotted line, and in 2 months you have a home. In Sweden, the focus has been more on multifamily, and it is still more on affordable. In Japan, it's pretty much market rate. They started with affordable, and they said, you know what, affordable is going to do its own thing. We're going to lower the cost of the missing market for everybody, right, which is why their supply is so high, by the way. And in Sweden, that has been the case. And in Sweden, 85 to 90% of single family is made in a factory. You wouldn't know that, and consumers have no issue with that. In the multifamily space, it's about 20%, which is quite high even by global standards. So that's where they've really innovated. And they've been able to take, for example, so light frame construction, our form of construction in the 1970s, during this energy crisis, went to Japan and went to Sweden They took not just these regulations, they took this technology, they made it better. And in Sweden, they're building 10-story towers out of light frame construction. So twice as tall as we can build today because they're building it in the factory. So
Yeah.
same land, same affordability, and they're able to provide it for condominiums, for apartments, even for sort of municipal housing, which is their version of public housing. So there's so much innovation, and those countries are different. Their contexts are different, sure. But the similarities are more relevant here than the difference.
Okay. So, we touched on this just a few minutes ago, but the reason why modular construction hasn't taken off here to the same degree, and we mentioned prescriptive versus performance codes. Tell me what the difference between prescriptive codes and performance-based codes is.
So prescriptive code basically gives you a recipe, and that's great if you're working status quo, and so you essentially fulfill that recipe. If you are an innovator and you're looking to save money or improve resilience, then you're really asked to do a lot of testing to prove that maybe your better solution is comparable to what might be a worse solution. In performance code, it's the opposite. Everyone has clear goals to meet. And then if you're a conventional builder, you're probably going to use what are called acceptable solutions, which are sort of like prescriptive codes. But if you're an innovator, you're not asked to do all of this testing. If your system can perform the same way in terms of fire, in terms of structure, you're not asked to do all this additional testing. It also means building products. In the European Union and Japan, it's not just the buildings. The building products have also been redesigned, like their nutritional labels for a broader audience are consistent so that when you pick up a piece of sheetrock or sheathing, that also has performance criteria. So you can mix and match things in ways that the code doesn't have to prescribe, which also makes the code, guess what, shorter, simpler, easier to understand for everybody.
And I think at the end of the day, anytime we can remove words out of regulations and make them clearer and more concise, that's a step in the right direction. So just for my listeners and for me, Ivan, bear with me.
You're doing great.
The way I'm envisioning prescriptive codes is a codes department will say to a builder, you must use this product. It must be this thick. It must be here. It must be affixed in this way. Whereas performance-based codes say the reason we had that prescriptive code was we wanted to be able to have a barrier for fire to penetrate a wall for a certain amount of hours or minutes. Performance-based codes would say, if I can achieve that same goal with a different material, that's okay.
That's right. And just to give you a very specific example that I think your listeners would know. And so in a company in Sweden, for example, is opposed to mixing sheathing for structural rigidity and drywall for fireproofing, they were able to just use 2 layers of a particular kind of more expensive gypsum product because for their factory process, it was more efficient. They didn't have to go back. So this isn't some big, change in innovation. We can't make these small changes without fairly onerous process because it's described, and prescriptive codes are there to help people. They're there to give quick solutions. That's fine. But unfortunately, what happens is then innovation is not just not encouraged, it's dissuaded.
Yeah. And look, tell me if I'm wrong about this, but I'm thinking specifically of there's a product that is marketed quite a lot these days, even here in the United States, called SIP, structurally insulated panels. That is a factory-built product that has a finished quality on the inside part, then it's got insulation, then an exterior rigid board form on the outside. Right. But in some municipalities, to build with SIPs, you've got to get exceptions and exceptions and exceptions.
Right. And it used to be that you had to do it everywhere. And then what we have to do in the US is instead of a regulatory environment that says an innovative product that meets those requirements is okay, what SIPs had to become was a building product. And now SIPs is a building product. And when it is a building product, when it has essentially is treated like gypsum, now it's easier. And that is the route. Okay. And so not to say that there aren't routes to getting streamlined. So the route today, so there are services that allow you to treat an assembly like a product. And that works. Okay. But that's something that, by the way, surprise, surprise, in the 1960s, that was something that in France and Sweden and UK and Japan was already a stepping stone. And we've got those stepping stones. I don't want to say we don't have them, but based on that experience, based on saying, wait a second, these product-like assemblies saved us money. It doesn't matter what they're made of. Why don't we make an environment that's like that? And why don't and what happened was it was the dialogue with other industries, Sweden, Volvo, and whoever, and in Japan, Toyota, was at the table and said, look, if you want cost savings, efficiency and materials alone won't do it. You need to change the way we design, we manage, and we regulate this product, and that will save you money. And it's been proven out. So in Japan, we got a number that was in the ballpark of 30% of savings because of this streamlined regulation, not less life safety. In fact, more life safety, more quality, more demand for ADA, more demand for aging in place, and yet less literally words, as you pointed out, in regulation.
Yeah, and you alluded to one of the factory processes, I think it was in Sweden, where they used a more expensive gypsum product, but it was more efficient in the long run, which leads me to the conclusion. So a modular process might be more expensive in certain ways, but if you realize efficiencies and you save time, for instance, I get my house in 2 months.
Yeah, imagine
then time is money. We all know that. So it's a push you pull me on different sides. But I think this is a really interesting topic to think about. Now, I want to switch gears real quick. Mm-hmm. Tell me about ModX. What is ModX, and what do you guys do?
Well, so thanks for asking. So ModX was founded by myself and Ryan Smith, who's also an architect and a researcher. We have a similar profile, and then we were joined by Tyler Schmetterer, who's actually comes from industry and who's really good at contracts, by the way. And so what we do is we're really based in research and objective research. While we love offsite, we have a tough love for that kind of sector as well. And what we do is we do research, we do executive education, and we do direct advisory, both to companies and to government, local government, federal government. And one of our really one of the projects we're most proud of that's been going on for a while is working with the National Institute of Building Science and the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development to really look at what research needs we have in this area and how can we kind of apply not just the lessons from abroad and from other industries, but the lessons that the U.S. has and has proven out in small scale, and how do we apply that at a large scale? So it's been that's been my breakthrough and really in life is ModX is really trying to make an instrument where we can really make positive change and make housing not just more affordable, but higher quality and more economic.
So just to kind of bring this around to the appraisal space, which is where I spend most of my time. So in real estate appraisal world, we deal with health and safety issues. If an appraiser is doing an FHA appraisal or a VA appraisal, they have to address issues of concern for health and safety and those kind of things. There's this notion in the real estate market here in the United States in general, specifically appraisal market and real estate agents as well, that modular construction means cheap and temporary. It's just kind of this vestigial of the double wide trailer from back in the day. It sounds like, after talking with you, that modular construction does not mean cheap and temporary.
That's right. And the reality is that we've had a serious housing crisis since the 1960s. Between 1960 and 1973, before HUD regulated the mobile home industry and turned it into the manufactured, we were producing, so in 1973, the peak year of mobile home production, 1 in 4 homes in America was a mobile home, self-regulated by the industry. So deregulation is not always the answer. Good regulation is the answer. So we're pumping out, because we had no alternatives. We were pumping out 1 in 4 units with, pretty poor construction very quickly that were not meant to last. And that has created a stigma. So even the manufactured housing industry, once HUD got involved, because of some of the research it did in Operation Breakthrough, manufactured homes are quite high quality, they're quite safe. Yeah. But we have not applied those lessons that actually took the mobile home industry, kept the price as it was, and improved at least the life safety. We have not applied those lessons to the rest of the housing sector. And in Japan, for example, the only housing that appraises, so Japanese people have a cultural bias towards buildings that have been around for a while. That's changed in the last 20 years. So most buildings depreciate in ways that we can't imagine. The only buildings in Japan that don't depreciate are not just modular buildings, but modular buildings built that are certified through this process from established companies that have a brand that we recognize, that are willing to stand behind that product, that offer guarantee and warranties. And so one of the drivers for buying a modular home in Japan today is the future appraisal value.
Okay.
So and that is, the reverse of what we experience. It's the only homes that appreciate, because one, there's a perception of quality, but there's also a perception of responsibility. That company's still there. That company knows every screw that went into that building. And it wants to continue to offer services to that homeowner.
Interesting. So, all right. So for my appraiser listeners out there, and look, over to Appraiser Learning, we have a course with Kathy Putnett on manufactured housing and modular housing where we talk about these things. But I think realistically, we appraisers need to start thinking about this in terms of utility at the end of the day, and not so much this is stick built, this was built in a factory, this is bad, this is good. What is the underlying utility of the structure? If a home is manufactured in a factory-like process and it has sustaining appreciation, in the valuation process, Fannie Mae and HUD and the VA all allow for mortgages on manufactured homes. And we're not talking about a home that has a chassis and a tongue and wheels still attached to it. We're talking about what amounts to better construction in the long run. So let me ask you this, Ivan. Last question. I appreciate your time. I know you've been here for quite some time. What do you foresee happening in the U.S. home construction industry over the next 10 years, and what would you like to see happen?
Well, I think we're seeing it. So we're seeing the 10 large builders, as part of some of the work we're doing, looking at ways how they can incorporate different kinds of offsite construction into their existing business model, or even trying new business model. And everybody's doing it. That you look at the list. Lennar, for us, is doing some really interesting things, but so is D.R. Horton, so is Toll Brothers. They're all looking at it. They're all trying to understand how to fit it into their model. At the same time, we're seeing startups that, like all startups, have some growing pains, trying to work from the bottom up and really work almost as vertically integrated entities and create the kind of brand recognition that I think an appraiser would really like, where it says it's not factory built or stick built. It's this company with this factory, with this guarantee, with this quality control. Come talk to us. This is a product. It's a customized product. And yes, we love appraisal. We love inspectors. We want to be inspected because we can't afford not to do quality. The problem is when we are treated like a stick-built, builder who may not have the time or the effort. So I see both happening, and there's going to be a dialogue because the alternative doesn't exist. We have less material, we have less labor. All the things that were happening in the 60s and 70s, which sound very familiar, are just worse. And we don't have an alternative. We're going to see different models. We're going to have different people trying it out, but some form of prefabrication and some form of pre-design is going to dominate that.
I love it. This is exciting stuff. I'm really hopeful, Ivan, that we can, through our channels, get some word out about the work that you're doing. I know being on the podcast like this will be really helpful to our listeners. Let's do this. I'm going to take a quick break, and we're going to hear from one of our sponsors, and we will be right back.
LIA Administrators and Insurance Services, serving valuation professionals since 1978. We provide E&O insurance with a commitment to superior customer service, outstanding liability education, and unmatched claim defense. Explore our exclusive appraiser liability education by Peter Christensen and cost-effective seminars designed to foster your growth. Our underwriters, with an average of 26 years of experience each, are dedicated to supporting appraisers. Visit liability.com to discover how LIA can safeguard your business.
Welcome back. You're listening to the Appraisal Buzzcast. I'm Hal Humphreys, your host. I'm joined today by Ivan Rupnik. He's an architect. He works with ModX, and we've been talking about modular housing and kind of about the idea of affordability, but not so much affordability as, I think, Ivan, am I wrong about this? It ends up being more of a sustainability issue in the long term. We've got modularized, sometimes panelized, compartmentalized building products that can be brought to a site and assembled in a way that is a long-lasting, solid structure, possibly even more long-lasting and solid than a stick-built home.
I would say, yes.
Okay.
For sure.
Well, Ivan, Jim Morrison, our producer, sometimes comes at me with this thing of an anonymous appraiser question where they try to trip me up. So, Jim Morrison, do we have an anonymous appraiser question today to try and grapple with?
We do, and this is a tough one, and Hal, you're going to have to do a lot of the heavy lifting on this because it gets into, specific rules for appraisal. But if anybody has any future questions for our guests, reach out to us at comments@appraisalbuzz.com. But here's the question that we have. It says, I'm looking for a definitive answer that can be quoted by an official written rule or regulation. For those questions, assume the houses are identical in size, interior finishes, exterior elevations, all being brand new construction. From an appraisal standpoint, what are the rules when assessing the value in the following scenarios? Modular construction versus site-built, and modular on-frame construction, meaning the frame is used for transport and becomes part of the permanent foundation, versus site-built or off-frame modular. Do modular constructed homes off or on-frame have to be disclosed once it's completed, and in any resales down the road?
All right. So since this is primarily a valuation question for appraisers and specific rules, I will pick up the water and try to carry it. As an appraiser, we are to measure market reactions to different things. Okay. So if we think in terms of utility, if a home is modular construction built on site and has identical utility to a stick-built home, I don't think I would address that any differently than I would a stick-built home. And here's the thing. If you go to the Fannie Mae Selling Guide, if you go to Fannie Mae, or actually selling-guide.fanniemae.com, it is a searchable document. You could go online and search it. Type in the word modular, and there are specific guidances there from Fannie Mae about what they will and will not accept. Here's the thing. If the home is on a chassis, and I think this is kind of the same across the country, if it's on a chassis, you're going to be looking for a HUD data plate. If it's not on a chassis, if it's assembled on site, Fannie Mae sees that as the same thing as a stick-built home. They're not going to differentiate between the two. If you have sales that are the same kind of modular construction, as an appraiser, I would like to use similar sales to compare to the subject. But if they're not available, Fannie Mae does not prohibit you from using stick-built construction to compare to the modular construction. But again, my suggestion would be to go to the Fannie Mae Selling Guide, do a search on modular. All you got to do is type in the word modular, and you'll come up with as the question asked for, written rules for appraisers for how to deal with these situations. That's my answer, Jim. Ivan, does that sound like, as a non-appraiser, someone who's out there in the world, does that sound reasonable to you?
Well, that's exactly how all the trade associations have encouraged the world to look at. We've also worked with Fannie Mae, so that's what we've told them. So it sounds like they picked it up. And the reality is that the confusion, maybe it's helpful for the listeners, confusion comes from the fact that modular construction is regulated by the same building codes, exactly the same building codes as stick built, whereas manufactured is by a different code. That's where the confusion is. The overlap, which trade associations don't like to talk about, is that when you ship a volumetric module, you are going through the same regulatory environment that you are when you ship a manufactured home. That's it. So there is a stamp associated with it, but that stamp has to do with the ability to ship across state lines or within states. That creates some of the confusion. And in fact, the state programs that facilitate both are often the same program. The regulations are different, which is why the regulations also which is why we've encouraged the idea to simplify these regulations. That's where it comes from. In reality, every modular product is designed for that locality's code. So it's based on whatever the model code is, but it's also based on all the variations. That's why, for all those reasons, it's at least as good, if not better.
Okay, very good. Jim Morrison, do we have anything else we need to cover today?
No, Ivan, thank you so much. My wife's an architect. She's going to love this episode. She's going to love getting into the code. She likes all that stuff. So we really appreciate your time today.
Thank you, guys. This was great.
Ivan, thank you. If we have nothing else, for Jim Morrison and Ivan Rupnik, I'm Hal Humphreys, and that is your Appraisal Buzzcast for this week.